Good morning. Round two. Different topic though. We're going to talk about a Jeff Gray video he put up asking whether or not a stop. He was the subject of a traffic stop. Whether that stop was legitimate. And to cut to the chase, I suspect that it would most likely be considered legitimate in court if it ever made it there, but I doubt it ever will, because number one, there's nothing really to sue for damages over. And number two, there was no evidence found that is going to be needed to be suppressed as a result of a bad traffic stop. So this is purely a hypothetical, a conjectural thing. And here's the basis of my rationale. Just for background, Jeff Gray was on the side of the highway that is closest to a Customs and Border Patrol checkpoint, filming the Customs and Border Patrol checkpoint. At some point in time, he determines that the gals inside are getting worried over his presence and his photography. So he goes to the other side of the public right-of-way, and he films from the other side of the public right-of-way. An officer comes up, he sees an officer approaching, and he decides he doesn't want to talk to the officer, and so he starts his car and starts driving away. The officer follows him and pulls him over. Jeff Gray handles the stop well as far as, making it clear that he's not a threat to the officer, but then he spills his guts because, I guess he didn't want to take the time to play with the cop that day. And again, I never recommend talking to the police, but I guess Jeff was more or less unscathed by it this time. But the officer assessed the situation and let him go. But in the meantime, Jeff asked, "Why did you pull me over?" And the officer said something along the lines of, "Well, you were suspicious, and then I pulled up and you left." Is that reasonable? Is that a reasonable stop? And Illinois v. Wardlow, I think, is the best Supreme Court case on point. I'm not familiar with whatever circuit. I think that's 11th Circuit. I think Florida's 11th Circuit. I'm not familiar with Florida or their particular laws on it. So just by general Fourth Amendment law, I would say that it is probably a valid stop. Illinois v. Wardlow suggests that if you fleeing is the sign basically of being guilty of committing a crime. And if you flee at the sight of the cops, that can be used to justify the stop. Now, there's going to be a lot of people screaming in the comments, mostly sovereign citizens and auditards screaming in the comments, name the crime, what crime was he committing, is suspicion a felony or a misdemeanor. But again, if you go back to Terry, they don't have to name the crime. All they have to do is have a reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot and be able to articulate specific facts, which would lead an officer in their position to the conclusion that crime is afoot. And it just has to be reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot. They don't have to prove that crime is afoot. They don't have to show by a preponderance of the evidence or by a clear and convincing evidence or by beyond a reasonable doubt that crime is afoot. It's just reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot. And fleeing does give reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot. And then when the officer made the stop, it was a very short detention, just long enough for the officer to satisfy his suspicion, and he determined very quickly that crime was not afoot. Like if you pulled up and the Kia was loaded up with automatic weapons or something, and there was a balaclava, whatever it is, the ski mask and body armor and stuff right there next to Jeff Gray, then maybe the officer might have had some reasonable suspicion to continue the investigation, to investigate further. And no, I'm not saying that having firearms in your vehicle or body armor is illegal, but again, the standard is there reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot? And people generally don't roll around with firearms and body armor in their vehicles. It's not a general thing to do. But I'm getting off point. I said a while back, unusual things generally are perceived of as giving reasonable suspicion. And, it's unusual for Jeff to be sitting there. It's unusual for people to film the Customs and Border Patrol. It's unusual for people to flee at the sight of a cop. those things combined would, I think, give the officer reasonable suspicion to pull over Jeff Gray, to satisfy his curiosity, and then let Jeff Gray go. So I hope that answers it. Thanks for watching. Have a great morning.